as I said, we don't know what's going to be the future trends in terms of consumption. But if you look at the world, it's very unlikely to see, say, sub-Saharan Africans and Indians and some South Americans going to accumulate a lot of lifestyle like we have in Europe or something like that. So that's not
and they were stored underground, and we are pulling it out from underground, putting it up in the atmosphere. So there's a massive transfer of carbon that was stored over our society is living without the sort of amount of energy that we've been consuming in the past. So the question is whether we're going to be, what are we going to do? So there's, of course, one problem is that the energy, this is fossil fuels, it's non-renewable, so they've got limits. Some people say we're not going to reach the limit, we're going to find solutions before we reach the limit. The analogy is that the Stone Age didn't finish by the lack of stones, we still have a lot of stones and we moved on. So that's possible, but if we maintain on the high the two other sides of the equation, if people are growing and consuming more, we can find other types of energy. But if they are based on what we produce on Earth, there's always bound to be a limit to it. So that's what I basically wanted to say on the causes of climate change. These are the three main aspects that we need to tackle to think about sustainability as a society. On climate change tendencies, several of you, especially those that are really aware of what's going on in social media and also some media, it seems as though the debate out there is about the climate deniers and the climate change deniers and the climate change believers. That's not true. The true debate out there is about what has been termed the type 1 climate change and type 2 climate change. So that's what climatologists are arguing. And the type 1 climate change is the gradual change in the climate that has been portrayed in the IPCC reports. So if you look at the scenarios, there's a tendency for increasing temperature, which is kind of gradual. And the type 2 acknowledges that no, this is not going to be gradual, it's going to be abrupt. And the rationale for that is past climate changes. If you actually look at the past climate changes, there is plenty of evidence that it has been abrupt. For example, in Europe at some point, we had a change of about 10 degrees in 3 years, a regional change. So basically Europe just changed massively from one climate regime to another climate regime. There's plenty of evidence in the paper record of these sort of abrupt climate changes. This time is different because it's not regional. In the past, these records are regional, but we don't know whether in the past they were global or just regional. The evidence is regional because it comes from fossils and from the polymer record, but there is a possibility that it was also global, but we still haven't figured that out. But from our knowledge, it's the first time that we have evidence that there is a global massive climate change, and those type 2 climate changers or modelers, they believe it's going to be abrupt. And in fact, it seems as though all of the predictions by IPCC were very conservative. We are indeed going, for example, this June we had a massive melting of Greenland, sorry, which was predicted to happen by the end of the century. So apparently the future is going faster. So the future is coming earlier than expected in terms of this projection, and that's because of this abruptness of the changes. I can tell you that a tale a few years ago I was involved in a large European project, and we had climatologists on board, I'm not one of them. And one of the scenarios was the grass cut. And the grass cut was where the thermohaline circulation in the ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean, was massively disrupted, and there was a triggering of a short glaciation in Europe that, as a consequence of massive melting disproportionate melting of the Greenland and the Arctic. This would mean that it was like a global cooling, but it would be a regional cooling as a consequence of that abrupt change. We ended up not using that scenario because the climatologists, in fact, every climatologist knows that in the past the changes were abrupt, but it's much more difficult, it's much harder to model tipping points and non-linear transitions than to model a continuous process. So to be on the safe side, they tend to portray the climate scenarios as a continuum when they know it's not going to be a continuum. So I guess that's a more realistic representation of what you do. So we ended up not, but this is changing. So I think we are now, the climatologists in IPCC are now being more upfront about these risks because they are very important. If what was projected by the end of the century will happen in 3 years' time, that's going to be massive. In terms of geopolitics, well, I've got a list of bullet points to help us think in the discussion. I'm going to enumerate them. Some of the risks, for example, in parts of the world like this one, but not only, there's going to be major challenges in terms of the redistribution of water, especially some areas that are already arid in the world. They will, most of the time, tend to become even more arid. So when there are communities already stressed by lack of water, there's going to be more stressed. There's an increase in the frequency, intensity, and duration of heat waves. Europe is already facing one of them. This year, Portugal has been spared, partly, so far. But Central Europe has been hit very, very hard. We're ready for 2 heat waves in 2 months, which is very unusual. Some record high. And that's, I mean, animals. I'm a biogeographer. I study how animals and plants change their distribution with climate change. But humans will also change in the past, and they will do so in the future. So there's, migrations is going to be a very strong issue. Is already now, and it's going to be even bigger with ongoing and future climate changes. Sea level rise. Well, I don't need to explain a lot, but coastal areas and island systems are becoming threatened. Some countries that are islands are predicted to be completely underwater very soon, so they will have to relocate totally. Some major cities in the world will be underwater unless major engineering projects are created to protect them with huge costs and doubtless effectiveness. Melting of the North Sea will create new routes that will create new opportunities for trade on the bright side, but we will also create lots of political tensions of who controls those routes. So in terms of geopolitics, that's fantastically important. I should mention Greenland because this is happening. The melting of Greenland is melting very fast, and the size of Greenland is not what you usually see on the map. It's much smaller, but still it's about France and Germany combined, and that belongs to Denmark. Denmark has been very cool about Greenland. You know, there's local communities in Greenland that want to be independent, and there was elections a few years ago. And the Independentist Party won the elections, and they went to Copenhagen and talked to the Prime Minister and said, I want the election, so would you give us independence? And he said, yeah, of course. This is a democratic process. So they didn't do what Spain did with Catalonia. If you want to go, you can go. So they had a press conference. In front of the press conference, the guy from Greenland said, we had a very positive and constructive conversation, going to be independent, and Denmark will continue to support Greenland through their policy of subsidies. And the Prime Minister said, no, you can be independent, but we will stop sponsoring Greenland. And then they stopped the process because they cannot leave without Denmark subsidizing Greenland. But that will be different when instead of being a massive ice sheet, it's land where forests can be grown and mining can happen. Denmark is already discussing what they will do in case they will talk again about independence, because now they can see enormous opportunities of grabbing some resources and becoming a different country just because that huge massive land is becoming available. So this is bound to happen in all sorts of places. I'm particularly worried, and I think it's important to have a discussion in Arctic and Antarctica. Arctic is melting, Antarctica is starting to melt. Antarctica is a massive continent. Once upon a time used to be covered by forests. So there's lots of resources stored there. Nowadays, there's both the Arctic and the Antarctic international ports for the management of those areas. multiple countries for science, cooperation and development, but that will change when what is at stake is not just ice and knowledge, but resources. Well, I think I'm running out of time, so my fourth and last point was about solutions. And, well, very briefly, demography is one of the big problems, as I mentioned, very difficult to tackle. I would like to hear some suggestions. I'm not going to say what I had here in stake, but China tried, failed. Usually this is solved by creating middle class, more fluent, more money, development, and people start having fewer kids, right? But then they will start consuming more. Consumption is being traditionally seen and discussed in the press and in politics as something that can be dealt and has to be dealt in the technological side. And of course, we are already producing machines that are more efficient, that consume less, and that eventually might consume other things apart from carbon. So there is a gain in efficiency that can be gained, thus reducing the per capita consumption, and we will be consuming other types of things through technological advancement. But whether we need major social and political changes is something that hasn't been really on the top of the discussion and probably should. My final point is about globalization. Globalization has been the blacklist of environmental movements for many years, and partly because of those anti-globalization movements we are where we are now, because that narrative created a constituency. But what people were really discussing was not globalization, because that's their state. Economic globalization, scientific globalization, this is there. It was political globalization. Some people fear that you cannot have economic globalization without political globalization. But once you start talking about political globalization, people say, well, this is a utopia. You can't really do that. I had lots of stuff about the targets and how useless they sometimes are. If you combine 6 of the most polluted countries, these 6 countries, they amount to 70% of the global emissions of CO2. So perhaps we don't need to agree among the 300 so nations. We might just need to agree with 6 nations, and that will have a tremendous impact on climate change. So it's much easier, and we should. I'm a great fan of globalization, but I think it's a far-fetched goal. It's for my kids, for my grandkids. The true political globalization, something like Star Wars, Federation, organization of the world. It will happen. It will have to happen, but it's not something that will happen in my generation. So we have to work harder on small sets of stakeholder countries and setting realistic, not necessarily targets because they tend not to work, but policies. And one of them is very simple. So we have to work through political conversions and economic conversion. What does that mean? Is that both the politics and the economy has to converge into climate change solutions. You cannot have one solution that goes into the direction of climate change mitigation and then another policy that goes in the opposite directions. Convergence is very important, and that can be done at the level of big organizations like the European Union, and should be done across larger bills of countries, including the EU, United States, and China, and perhaps India as well. So I think I'll stay here. Just perhaps a final note of provocation. I talked about globalization, and the big question is, what should we object or subject to globalization? Which power should we release, right? And we already released, we have this model for the Arctic and for Antarctica of power sharing of large portions of land on Earth that were kind of useless for most of economic activities, that they will be kind of useful in the future. So I mentioned there was lots of tension. There will be tension about who controls those resources and those lands, but there is also an opportunity to use those lands for international cooperation, conservation biology, using them as carbon sinks and biodiversity sinks as well, sources. So there are opportunities for international cooperation in those lands, but also in other lands. I think it's very important that something is done about the Amazonian rainforest, because very important role in climate regulation and biodiversity conservation. And that, of course, belongs to separate countries, but the responsibility they hold is much bigger than and there were accords in the past that were working. For example, Brazil had a series of targets for stopping the deforestation that were completely halted now. So Brazil got a lot of money to actually not destroy the Amazonian rainforest, and now is destroying the Amazonian rainforest. And that's because they can. They did in the past, but now they can. So that raises a number of interesting political issues.
Thank you very much.
Apologize. Thank you very much for this kind invitation to join the meeting, and I'm very happy to see that it's happening in Lisbon and in Portugal. So I congratulate Cristina Lagos as President of the EF and all the members of the board for this happening, and I'm really proud to have it in Portugal this time. Well, I had the same problem with Miguel, so I prepared the text in Portuguese, but then when arriving, I realized that I would have to do it in English, so I apologize if this is a very bad translation, but I will do my best. The topic is very challenging, so I prefer to write the text in English, and I apologize for this quick translation. The commitment to sustainable development, namely after the Rio Summit on Environment and Development in '92 and the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, is one of the biggest challenges facing Portugal and the world. Climate change, population growth, water and food management, protection of the oceans, conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services are increasingly determining choices and decisions in any country. Environmental and social and political issues intersect and influence each other, increasingly justifying joint reflection by public authorities. In this regard, I recall an analysis by Nicolas Hulot, former Minister for the Ecological and Solidarity Transition of Emmanuel Macron. We have to combine the problems of the end of the month and the problems of the end of the world. With some controversial inspired exceptions, world leaders today recognize the severity of climate change and its impacts on human communities, natural resources, and infrastructures. On the other hand, globalization has been transforming economic models, supply chains, labor markets, industrial relations, and migrative flows. Millions of people today work in an economy facilitated by digital technology and backed by advances in robotics and artificial intelligence. This combination is a window of opportunity for the territories and the world economies. If properly framed in the goal of decarbonizing the economy by 2050, a collective and universal commitment to reach the goal of limiting the global temperature increase of the planet. Today's major political problems are clearly connected, from the fight against terrorism, migration, development of new models of environmental sustainable economic growth, the promotion of tolerance in multicultural societies. Solving them will only be possible and credible in a globally committed and supportive architecture. These developments require a strong, effective system of international rules and institutions to ensure that justice is at the center of governance, and decision-making and strong support for the United Nations must be maintained. Without the organization, we would not have the Paris Agreement, even though we can discuss it further, on climate change or the 2030 Agenda and its goals for sustainable development, which are mandatory roadmaps in the fight for a better world. This does not mean that the United Nations should be immune to criticism or reform. The challenge for the United Nations is now far greater than trying to maintain peace and security between nations or contemporarily between the superpowers. It is to develop inclusive, fair, and viable solutions to the economic, social, humanitarian, and environmental problems facing the planet. The global political climate has changed dramatically in the last 3 years. The financial crisis has led to growing opposition to globalization and has fostered resurgence of populist, protectionist, and xenophobic policies. Much of the hope and unity that could be observed in Paris in 2015 has been replaced by fear and unhope. Brexit and Donald Trump's election are just two examples, but we can see comparable trends across Europe and around the world. The unworthy, simplistic, and biased politics of populism is the antithesis of all we can desire. It will always be a policy that consciously disregards the values of solidarity and justice, which are the identity of sustainable development. These are also intimidating times and circumstances, particularly for women and minorities, so often under the cowardly cloak of anonymity that abounds in social media. That is why the times also demand for more from those who still believe in solidarity and justice and cannot choose silence. And we don't have to wait for global leadership. The reaction to isolationism, populism signals some hope. In addition to formal contexts of governance, cities, business, and the average citizen and young people, increasingly those who speak out and demand action across Europe are committed to achieving the success of the Paris Agreement. There is a growing and rewarding affirmation of a global citizenship that acts and influences, and there is also recognition by local business and leaders that policies for sustainable development and climate action meet their interests and interests of consumers economically and electorally. This is not an utopia, but rather an act of intelligence. Sustainable promotion policies are truly the most transformative, rational, and most intelligent policies any organization or community can adopt and promote. The Agenda 2030 and the 17 Goals for Sustainable Development cover all aspects of life and human development, from health, education, and the environment to peace, justice, security, and equality. Unlike the Millennium Development Goals that precede the SDGs, they apply to all countries, not just developing countries. Thus, every head of state, every government, every citizen has a responsibility to ensure that these goals are met. The SDGs are the only prosperity and security response. Instead of restricting international relations to trade and trade wars, these goals affirm the power of a multicultural diplomacy and the United States by collective interests. Continued and intense political pressure is needed to address the underlying causes of the problems that SDGs signal: poverty, discrimination, conflict, and inequality. Indeed, if we do not place inequality at the center of the development agenda, we will be doomed to collective disaster. We need the courage to confront the political, commercial, and economic interests that seek to maintain the present unequal order and seize the opportunity that the transition to a low-carbon economy offers us by correcting the inequalities. We need to promote agreements, inclusion, and consensus to achieve policies that work for the common good rather than limiting self-interests in both the public and private sectors. And we need to inspire hope in all sectors of society, especially young people, by letting them know that their voices will be heard, their experience and knowledge, and their ideas welcome in public policy making. A recent inequality report by Oxfam reveals that over 80% of the wealth generated in 2017 went to 1% of the global population. This is a scandal. A paradigm shift in international economic and fiscal policy is urgently needed, valuing a holistic approach that values access to health, education, and justice as drivers of a sustainable and green growth pattern. It is equally imperative to accompany cultural change and change practices that prevent women, young people, sexual minorities, or persons with disabilities and other vulnerable and marginalized groups from developing their full potential. We must listen to the voice of those most affected by inequality and face the challenge of unsustainable lifestyles, production and consumption patterns, and the impact of population growth on the future of our planet. In 10 years, we'll be another billion inhabitants. The unsustainability of a development model that persists in the misconception that resources can continue to be exploited without regard to their finitude, compromising the future and closing their eyes to growing and unacceptable inequality, is becoming increasingly evident. The awareness of the limits and the perception that we are living a critical environment and social moment no longer expresses an utopia or a disproportionate stubbornness of some who do not trust the ability of man to find the solutions they want from science and technology. Just look at the scenarios and numbers objectively. The planet's global population, the demographic evolution in the next decade, we will reach 8.6 billion. That is, by 2030, will be another billion inhabitants using space and resources. Will be many more driving cars, traveling by plane, demanding more food, building more houses, and drinking water. If everyone adopts per capita consumption habits similar to those of Americans or Europeans today, resource depletion and planet degradation are inexorable, with or without climate change. As this perception becomes ever clear, and more universal, realize that much must be different, making a green agenda unavoidable, in which clean energy, clean cars, efficient use of water and energy determine its very own future of the next global industries. We may change our individual behavior patterns, but we also need leaders who bring viable, systemic, and sustainable changes in scale and speed. The market must reflect the ecological and human cost of economic decisions and define cost information to make the consequence of action and inaction transparent. Pollution, including carbon emissions, cannot continue without punishment. Subsidies must be transparent and eliminated for fossil fuels by 2020. Consider new ways of measuring development behind GDP. These are recommendations that are not even new, appearing in the Brundtland Report in 1987, Our Common Future. So I've prepared this as a common basis, but I guess I still have some time because I would like to come up with 2 or 3 additional comments. We are living the age of the Anthropocene. It is clear for everybody that humanity is changing the planet at a very fast rate, and we cannot expect a better future using this kind of using the same approach and the same development approach. I would like to give you, of course, on the other hand, and I was just yesterday reading a few examples of what's going on in the world, and it's really very impressive. If you, Miguel was considering the examples of what's going on in the Arctic and the Antarctic, but just very close, we have the Sahel and the situation in North Africa, which is a lot of pressure. It will pose a lot of pressure on resources, migration flows, and so many aspects. So we do have to come up with global solutions and global institutions and global approaches, but it's not easy. I tend to subscribe what Miguel was saying about let's go for a minor grouping of countries and work with them, because basically they are the majority and they're playing the major role in all these changes. But in any case, we do need to come up with some international solutions, especially regarding the change from our energy, the kind of supported development. This Green Deal, the Green Agenda does need powerful political forces in order to cope with this, with the big corporations that are really managing the world and managing this, especially with energy. the change in energy is crucial to change what is going on in the world. On the other hand, I also think that we do need to come up with global solutions and for water and food and biodiversity. These have to be part of the agenda, not only climate change, because climate change is supported by the energy issues and fossil fuels. It's already been discussed, but we also need an agenda for common good regarding water, biodiversity, and food. So this cannot be done without this kind of global agreements. Of course, we do need, and this is probably part of discussion, carbon markets. The carbon markets have to be again, I mean, they were in the Paris Agreement, but as you all know, in the Paris Agreement, the responsibility was, in the end, it is finally from the states, and you cannot expect that the states will run this issue. I mean, this will be very difficult, and this was probably the big failure of the Paris Agreement, even though I support it and I think we have to go with it. It's a failure in a sense that we cannot force any country to do what has to be done. And of course, the corporations are there. They are, in fact, leading all these issues, and it will be very difficult to force these carbon markets. My hope is also in the new generation and the new movements, social movements that we are seeing every day, everywhere. And I hope that this new generation, frankly, can make the difference with these new leaders, young leaders. They can make the human civilization where it should go, which is a world that is for all of us, where we can live well all together in peace and with an ecological mandate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena. Please, Bernardo.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Two comments before I start. One is that whatever I'll say today is on me and not on any organization that I work for or represent. And the second comment is that I've known Helena de Freitas for about 20 years, and you will see how obviously we are friends after you listen to her and you listen to what I have to say. We probably should have written this together to make it easy to everybody else. A little over a century ago, more precisely in the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day, the Great War was ended. It was a war that started by ignorance and stubbornness, where we fought along long lines of trenches that crisscrossed Europe, where we used new technology, and more than 20 million people died. Peace came, and the horrors that we witnessed in those 4 years proclaim us to claim that we had survived a war to end all wars. But peace was as selfish, stubborn, and short-sighted as war, and less than a generation later, we were at war again. A more violent, technological, and destructive conflict, a war that showed us the absolute evil, and where close to 80 million people lost their lives. The peace of 1945, born in the battlefields and in concentration camps, was a different kind of peace. It was a generous peace that brought enemies together into a common house, that promotes knowledge, collaboration, and agreement. It was a peace that took care of the living on both sides of the trenches and learned from the 1918 mistakes. It was also peace that gave comfort to a new level of collaboration between people and leaders who, having survived madness and blindness, had the intelligence and the vision to share resources and build together. In that solidarity, under the shadow of the Iron Curtain stretching, as Churchill said, from Stettin in the Baltics to the Trieste in the Adriatic, the European Union was born. This new peace grew quickly and with bold advances and strategic fallbacks, supported in memory and history, we fulfilled the 1918 pledge we had survived, a war to end all wars in Europe. Later, in 1989, the Iron Curtain fell too, and we substituted the borders of a Cold War, still a war nonetheless, for an area of freedom and rule of law that allow us to depart the shores of the Atlantic right here in Lisbon and drive to the borders of Russia without the need to show a passport or to exchange currency. War became a memory, and peace and freedom became certainties. And the giants that were able to look into the past and change the future joined the history books themselves. In their place, a new generation of managers arose, exchanging the greatness of ideas and courage to shape Europe and the world for a spreadsheet and a notion of history that lasts for an election cycle, a shareholder meeting, or a news headline. Time marches on, and the horrors that force us to impose the values of peace and cooperation upon the historic atavism of war became themselves just part of history. And even when history knocked on our doors in the 1990s in Sarajevo again, or challenge us today in new forms of populism in Warsaw, Budapest, or Rome, we pretend that they're nothing more than unfortunate incidents that we care not to understand. Are we doomed to repeat the past failures? What is the idea that will carry us, the happy recipients of the peace of 1945 and the freedom of 1989, to once again transcend our borders and our mistrusts? What is the common cause that will bring us together in the 21st century? Let us not deceive ourselves. The old nationalistic, isolationist, belligerent, and untrusting blind Europe has not vanished by as if a miracle. It's still there. It's waiting to take the place left empty by a Europe of shared values and shared history, too busy looking at its brilliant but short past and failing to grasp its uncertain future. There are, however, signs of change ahead, signs that we may be witnessing the birth of a new cause, a cause that millions of high school students took up on when they staged inorganic strikes across the world to save the planet. The cause embraced by a next generation to be entrusted with the management of government and business and organizations, the cause of combating climate change. Potentially more destructive than war, and surely too big to be addressed by individual states and organizations, climate change demands the same level of vision, partnership, collaboration, and solidarity that were in the core of peace in Europe for over 17 years. Climate change may have the capacity to bring us all together in a common ambition that is not limited to, but needs to go beyond the borders of Europe. In fact, the time for the debate on the ambiguity and contradictions between development and climate change is over both for developed and developing countries. It is over because science tells us that the clock is running down and we're living in borrowed times. We just cannot postpone it anymore. It is also over because the development model has changed dramatically and existing developing countries need not, nor should they have to, follow the same paths to social development and economic growth that existing developed countries walked since the 18th century. Additionality, or in additional, the main culprits of climate change are not in the developing world, but in the developed or fast-growing economies, including major European nations. Is the future, therefore, full of promises, potential, and achievement? No, it is not. Indeed, the path is neither easy or unhindered. In our new century, we face three different models of development, espousing different goals. Some argue that the world should be governed on the network of bilateral agreements and competing national interests. Others decouple economic and social growth from political rights and democracy, putting a premium on the former and ignoring or even disavowing the latter. The European model is based on lessons of history and on the solemn proclamation of ambitions for common dignity. As we seize the fight against climate change, we must equally embrace the fight against poverty, ignorance, discrimination, violence, diseases, and all other forms of human affliction that are beneath the shared goal of individual and collective human rights for all. To reach the goal of environmental sustainability, social development, and economic growth, the world needs to invest $5 to $7 trillion a year, and existing fundings result in a gap of $2.5 trillion every year. In developing as in fighting climate change, we cannot go as business as usual. We need to overcome all prejudice, rethink our approach to sustainable development, and incorporate previously excluded actors, namely the private sector. Business and corporations are key elements for sustainable development, for there is honorability in individual progress generated by a well-paid job, allowing children to go to school instead of having to work. And there is virtue in the collective advancement induced by business paying their taxes, allowing governments to provide for public policy. If we act now, it may not be too late for the people, the planet, the prosperity, the peace, and the partnership that the world agreed upon in 2015 when we approved the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agenda for Climate Change, and the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action. If the European model, imperfect, incomplete, and flawed as it is to succeed, we need to summon everyone to do their fair share. Developed and developing nations and international organizations, NGOs and civil societies, universities and research centers, corporations, business, and small and medium enterprises, as well as each of us. This new idea of Europe, a champion against climate change, a supporter of inclusive economic growth, and a promoter of social development in a multilateral cooperation, is not actually new. It's the same pursuit of peace that brought us together in 1945 and the freedom that we celebrate over the remains of the Berlin Wall in 1989. There may be a future yet for a generous idea of Europe and indeed for the world. But we must not only hope. We need to act now, and we need to act it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. Please, Dr. Figueiredo.
Good morning. First of all, I am very thankful to the organization to be here with you. But I decided to have a small presentation because my English sometimes is not so good that I wanted. First, I wanted to say one thing which is very important. We are facing with two different kinds of problems. One is global changes, and I will say that global changes are linked with the human species. And the most important thing that our species has discovered in the last years is an extraordinary thing. We can influence the climate of Earth. This is something of a huge process of maturity for our species. But it puts a problem in what concerns what we are going to do with this discovery of power. Geopolitics are completely different from global change. Geopolitics belongs to rivalry, competition, and cooperation between big states, big powers, other states, and non-governmental organizations, in turn of a very important problem. The world international system is anarchic, but is very organized. And the fight, or the big powers, try to influence this organized architecture. The hegemonic wars have been all of them existed all of them because of this problem of organizing an anarchic system. This is an introduction. I think that we must also regard history and discover that climate change as a global change as always have big geopolitics influence. I am going to use an example of a period, not a warming period of Earth, but of a cooling period of Earth between 536 to 660, which was known as the latent weak little ice age. During this ice age, we have huge movements, huge crises, huge events in the planetary organization of states and societies. The establishment of the Justinian plague, the first big bubonic plague that began in Egypt and after went to Europe. The transformation of the Eastern Roman Empire, the collapse of the Sasanian Empire in Persia, movements out of the Asian steppes and Arabia Peninsula, the spread of Slavic-speaking peoples, and political upheavals in China. I am not going to, because I am not able to do this, obviously, try to develop the ideas of what kind of geopolitical events are going to happen in next decades. But I want to focus only in one of these things, the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is perhaps the most evident event in what concerns the conscience that we can influence the climate. But the problem with agreement, because sometimes I think it is a marvelous happening of diplomats and lawyers, but also of economists, because the Paris Agreement treats the climate as an economist will treat macroeconomic planning. And it is very different to treat the climate or to govern macroeconomy, because one of things that the Paris Agreement doesn't have is the mobilization of human ingenuity to discover new technologies to tackle the problem of the climate. And without new technologies, we are limited to renewables. I will not say what is my opinion about renewables, but I will say that the most trying to see next decades, I think that if Paris Agreement does not develop initiatives for cooperation between states in new technologies, and I will speak about two of these technologies after this introduction, I think that it is going to be a flop. And when we discover that it will be a flop, many are going to say one thing which is very clear. We must regulate the production of oil and gas if we want to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But I will remember you and myself that not geopolitics, but the extraordinary event, which is that the most big reserves of oil and gas are under states with Muslim civilization. If we decide to stop the extraction of oil and gas, we are not going to resolve the climate change, and we are going to put all the Middle East and Central Asia in fire. It is very important to have this in consideration. So I think we have three main challenges as a species. First of all, we must change the world energy paradigm to become capable of long-term influence on the climate. More focus on sustainable hydrogen and nuclear fusion. I was very impressed when I, in 2060, I was reading in internet, and I discovered that the Potsdam Institute has discovered that the amount of of carbon dioxide that we have put in the atmosphere will have an extraordinary consequence. The next ice age can be postponed 100,000 years. So, but we know very well that the warming that is linked with carbon dioxide is a very dangerous thing. So we must define energy paradigm that can be useful to our species today and in the next centuries. And this must be a very more equilibrated approach. I speak about hydrogen because hydrogen, as you know, today is extracted from natural gas or from oil in chemical processes. And hydrogen is very useful, but as it is being produced today, it sends to the atmosphere a huge quantity of carbon dioxide. So when I say we must work about sustainable hydrogen, is what is nowadays being searched in the United States, in Germany and Europe, which is to extract hydrogen from natural gas, obtaining no carbon dioxide, but solid carbon. Because solid carbon is the material of the future. We had a Stone Age, we had a Bronze Age, we had an Iron Age, and we are entering the Carbon Age of materials. I'm not going to develop this, I can explain you in the debate. And nuclear fusion, I think I have a slide, but I think I must reduce the exposition. And what this slide said, MIT in the United States have been developing a fusion power approach, which use something which we have not in quantities in Earth, which is helium-3. And this leads us to the second objective, the second challenge of our species, to go to outer space. To go to outer space, and I decided to put you for three examples of big powers. The first one is an enterprise, a firm in the United States with planetary resources that have discovered that we have 16,000 asteroids around Earth. And they decided to go there with robots, naturally, to extract minerals. The second example is a China one. China in 2050 announced that it wants to go to the moon to extract helium-3. And the Japanese decided to have in 2024 a base in the moon, which is going to be constructed with robots commanded in Earth. So our species is preparing to go in the outer space, searching for materials that we have no in Earth, or that we are in the future with some problems of supply. But the third and last thing I will say is we must go to geoengineering, but a special kind of geoengineering, which is greening the deserts and planting there new forests. This is a very interesting thing about Africa. Scientists have discovered that Africa has 100 times more water under the ground than in the Earth's surface. And this is going to be very useful to green Sahara and Sahel and to plant a new forest there. All of these things are obvious, foolish. They have not to do with values, but with the power of the brain. And we must respect very much our species. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. To gain some time and give the opportunity to the public to be in this debate, I will make only 2 questions for all of you. And going from the micro to the macro. As a journalist covering international politics, it's very usual to find the climate change and geopolitics related. For example, if you look to the conflicts in Nigeria nowadays, some people say that is a conflict between Muslims and Christians, but if you look more closely, you will see a conflict between shepherds and farmers. At the same time, if you look to the competition between China and the United States for being the next superpower, for example, the shale oil and gas production in the United States suddenly gives a lot of new geopolitical influence to the United States. This is probably the reason why the Middle East is not so important in the foreign policy of Donald Trump as for other presidents. I would like to have a comment of you in these both extreme situations, the local and the global. Thank you. Bernardo probably will be the first. Do you mind? Okay.
Thank you. Well, there's no obvious answer, just trying to avoid to say the obvious thing, which is wars and conflict normally tend to be about resources. If everybody had access to everything that they need, we probably would be living an age of peace forever and ever and ever. The issue of local or global conflicts tend to follow the same patterns and the same necessities. But we need to find a way of doing 3 different and 3 very difficult things. One is to grant to everybody their rights and ability to enjoy those rights. And that goes for the people living in very wealthy nations as well as for people living in poor nations. The second thing that we need to do at the same time is doing so in a climate of debate, of conflict, of confrontation. And we as a species have better than that in the past than we are now in the present. Looking at Europe, for instance, and please disregard the fact that during the 1990s we had a war outside, just on the border of the European Union. But looking to the world history between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Twin Towers, we managed through an amazing moment of multilateralism to solve or to address an enormous amount of number of problems that we were facing in the world. We ended apartheid. We ended the war in the Balkans. We managed to grant independence to Timor-Leste, something that is very close to the Portuguese imagination. We ended, we created a new form of relationship in Latin America, between Latin America and North America. We almost solved or improved the relationship between Israel and Palestine, in Jerusalem. So when we talk about conflict, we talk about how to deal with the local conflicts or the major world changing conflicts. What history tells us is that when we do it in an international environment of cooperation, naturalism, and international law, we probably we do go much further and much better, and we are much more efficient in doing so. Nowadays, we're going the other way around. Multilateralism is in decline, bilateralism is in the growth, and what was just said in the previous presentation about the impact of the economic model of oil in the Middle East is something that we can probably need another. It's something that we need to look not only for the Middle East, but we need to look across the globe. The way of solving issues has to be on a multilateral, collaborative, international organization model. That much history shows us. But then we need to add national issues, regional issues, and concerns. But if it was easy to do it, we probably have done it ages ago. Thank you.
Okay. Please, Elena.
Well, thank you for because these are very good examples. Of course, it seems that we are in a sort of denial stage. It's a kind of a social, psychological denial stage, because we all know, and we all are pretty aware that we have to change things. Resources are, of course, infinite, and even science and technology cannot solve the critical issue. And the critical issue is that we have to change some of our traditional actual rules. The example of the Sahel is very interesting. I don't know if you are all aware of it, but Sahel is the region of Africa between 400, 700 kilometers from north to south, and that we have about 8 countries in this part of Africa. And these countries are Senegal, Djibouti, I wrote so that I could, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. These are the countries that are in the Sahel region. So from the aridity of the Africa up to the steppes of Sudan. And the lack of water in this part of the world is becoming more and more a critical issue. And then you have the pressure of the shepherds, as you said. And this is not new. And in fact, about planting trees, this is a project that is ongoing by the Europeans, especially not funded by the European Union, the African Union, the World Bank, and it's an ongoing project. They are trying to plant millions of acacia trees in order to sustain this progress of the aridity of the area and try exactly to promote the combination, the use by the shepherds and the use by the communities in general. And this is not working. In spite of millions of dollars that have been invested, it's not working. And of course it's not working because it's not possible to work, because the pressure is too high, and we cannot just think that we will solve it by using one tree, because we have to choose one tree that is the only tree that may grow in these conditions. But of course, even with this tree, it's not possible. Some things are simply not possible. But of course, we may come up with new technologies and new trees and maybe new fancy trees that can cope with these stress conditions, but we don't have it yet. And as we don't have it yet, we have to cope with the communities and populations claiming for food, for water, and for well-beingness. And this is absolutely just, perfect, and they deserve it. And so we are facing these new problems that are a direct outcome of this situation, which is migration of communities, because of course they look for better conditions. This is not new. In fact, the problem of Syria is again an issue that is somehow equivalent. It's another kind of problem, but it was the migration of the populations, the communities from the rural areas into the cities that somehow started the conflict in Syria. So these sort of conflicts are going to happen more and more, and they are not by chance. They are because we have inequality is increasing worldwide, and we keep the kind of development where 20% of the world population is living upon the resources of the other 80% that are living below the conditions that we should allow them to live. So this is the main issue, and this is the critical issue. And the only way to solve it is to change the development paradigm. That's no other way. And it is a fact that we have most of the power are, of course, and this is a direct output of the history of the world, as Bernard was presenting. After the Second World War, this was a decision. The decision was to bring, instead of having conflicts and to stop war conflicts, let's trade among each other, and let's make the trade and new trades and new connections the future of the world. This was, in a way, it was a good decision. But as most of the money and most of the power was given to one superpower, we've been living for the last decades with the strong influence of this superpower, and this superpower somehow promoted the idea that we can continue and go on exploiting the resources of the 80% of the world and keep well-being in 20% of the world. We cannot sustain this. Cannot go on like this. And this is a direct effect of the kind of development that we've been imposing. So we do have to change from fossil fuels into clean energy. The energy is critical, it's true, and it is also true, and following what you have been saying, that of course the United States, now they have the shale gas is an option, and it's of course changing a lot of the geopolitics, because of course they don't have to rely anymore they don't have to rely for the next decades on the fossil fuel that is coming from other parts of the world, so they can somehow prepare their own development strategy. But this is when we consider that we have a world like this, as a kind of bilateral and isolationism, we cannot go on like that. We have to promote other world where everybody can participate in the processes, and everybody can make a decision and take part and join the decision process. So this is the kind of world I want to live and I want to promote. Is another world where we stop as soon as possible the use of fossil fuels. Of course, this is not easy. I know, I understand. This is a process, and it's not easy to build up the solutions to change. And I agree that the Paris Agreement was not as successful as I was expecting, as I'd like to. But it is a stage of this process. We have to go deeper and further, and with more competence and intelligence, and I have a lot of confidence in the intelligence of many of the world, and especially, as I said, the young generation. I do think that they will put a lot of pressure on the global leaders, and somehow we will manage. But there's no other way. Even though I agree, and I'm a scientist, so I agree that we would need more science, more technology, because even with stopping and accomplishing the roadmap that is on stage now, we won't make it. So it's clear for everybody that we won't make it. So we will need, of course, technologies and science in order to promote CO2 sequestration and a lot of changes that we and like organizing cities, and well, a lot of challenges we have ahead. This is true, but there's no other way of doing it if we don't stop using the fossil fuels. So I'm not in the denial stage. I'm already overcome it. So I am one of those that believe that there's no other way for the world. So
let's hear Felix about that.
Thank you very much. I think we must take two questions. The first question is, we have today in the United States brought by Elon Musk what I think is the paradigm change based on renewables, because what has Elon Musk brought? First, all of the unifamiliar houses of the United States must be covered with photovoltaic panels. Second, all the unifamiliar houses must have a power wall, which is a form of stocking power generated by photovoltaic panels. And third, we must buy Tesla cars with batteries, lithium batteries, for which it has built a huge factory all covered by photovoltaic panels. He has done this basically counting with the capital markets of the United States, because, as you know, in the capital markets of the United States, as obvious, is the evil power. We must be in accord with that. It is the representation of evil in Earth. But the capital markets of the United States finance everything that, in their opinion, have future. This is the first idea. Second idea is that 4 years ago, it is about the hegemonic power. 4 years ago, came to Portugal, to the commercial chamber of Lisbon, a very nice Chinese woman that belonged to a think tank of the government, of the Chinese government. And she came to explain for what was the new Silk Road. And she began by saying two things. First, we had a Britain Empire as the organizer of a huge globalization process. Second, after the Second World War, came the American to construct a new globalization. Nowadays, we have China, which wants to be the leader of the third globalization. So we understand that we have an hegemonic war between what I call the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere are not only the English, but the British and the United States. British, United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, and Israel. This is what I call the Anglosphere. This is going to be a very dramatic. This is going to be a very dramatic event, a fight for hegemony. But I think technology, space, and Africa can be places where we can put to work together, China, United States, Japan, and so on, Russia, and so on. We must work with the kind of people that is our species, and not with an imagined people which will be all of us saints. We are not saints. And we must discover that we can do extraordinary things not being saints.
Thank you. Your comment, please.
I think a lot has been said already. I also believe we're not saints, and we have to work with what we have, which is human species, selfish, with all of the characteristics that made us a success. We've exterminated the other species of humans that existed. You know, once in the Iberian Peninsula we had the Neanderthal species. We wiped it out. We wiped it out other human species, and because they were too similar to us, they were competing to us, and we didn't really relate to them in the same way as we relate to other Homo sapiens. So I think it's the problem with discussing geopolitics is that we all come with our baggage. We all have opinions about all sorts of things about politics. Some are from the left, others are from the right. Some are conservatives, others are more liberals. And that's fine. You know, we all have opinions, and that's good. We live in a democracy, and certainly from these viewpoints, these different neurological circuits, we'll find solutions. But I think we shouldn't be distracted by what we're talking about here. And we're talking about here as a major new event. The climate is changing. This is not a hype. It's changing. It's changing faster than expected. And that will lead to a not unprecedented, I wouldn't say it's unprecedented change in the climate of the world, because we had previous past climate changes, and we had to adapt to some of them. For example, when there was, if we actually, I'm a geographer, so I like to look at maps. If you look at the distribution of the world civilizations, we have the Andean civilizations, Mayas, and Aztecas, and then you have the Mediterranean civilization, you have the Chinese civilization, and they all have something in common. Latitude. They all are at about the same band of latitude. And why is that? Well, because they all were climate refugia in the past. When the climate changed from glacial interglacial periods, those areas remained relatively stable, and more importantly than stability, they remained within what is the climate conditions for sustaining life. So, you know, we just imagine, we don't have hard evidence, because of course this was a long time ago, and we only have the fossil record, but there was movements north-south, and they all were converging to those areas of relative stability. Those was areas where they could live for a long time, and also benefit from cooperation, from information coming from different parts of the world, right? Those guys from the north coming to the south and bringing some technology. This happened in the Mediterranean, we know that. So climate has historically had a very important role in determining and driving civilization and patterns of civilization. And this is going to still be the same now, even though we are more independent to climate than we were in the past. We have technology. And I'm divided upon what Felix was saying about, we're going to the moon and getting new minerals, and I kind of like to think along those lines, because I think optimism is what we have to get out of this mess, right? We have to be optimistic. We have to be. We can't fall for the fear or for being too negative. Although the situation is dire, it's difficult. We don't have the solutions as yet. We don't know how to solve the crisis, but it's not going to be solved with pessimism, if it's going to be solved at all. So I believe it's becoming obvious, and this is now I'm going. If we want to get out of this solution, we will have to be looking out of space, unless we're going to be changing dramatically our lifestyle. That is, as I said, we've been living in a credit of energy that the planet has been storing for over millions of years. That will run out at some point. We don't know when it will run out. 20 years, 40 years, 100 years, 200 years, we don't know. But that's the sort of time span that we have ahead, probably less than 200 years. All of these fossil fuels will go away. We'll run out of them. So we have to find a solution. And that solution will have to come from solar energy, inevitably, wind energy, gravity, and other solutions, but there will not be. We cannot rely on fossil fuel. The trouble is that at the moment, even photovoltaic cells, they need lithium, which is also finite mineral. So nuclear energy also relies on rare minerals. So we don't have a panacea. We don't have a solution. So we cannot pretend we have one, and also being optimistic is nice because that's the right attitude. But we cannot build optimism on denial of the problems. So I think, we have to be pessimistic, optimistic in a way. We have to be realistic in a sense. Yeah, well, the diagnosis has to be right, because we cannot build a future based on the wrong diagnosis. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says you have got a cancer, you cannot live happily after ignoring the cancer. I mean, you can be aware you've got a cancer. Maybe I have like 1, 2, 10 years of life and to take the best of it, but you cannot build a future based on denial of the present. So I think one of the problems between this dichotomy between the optimists and pessimists is that there seems to be a correlation between optimism and denialism, and then pessimism has correlated with a lack of intelligence in finding good solutions, right? So we have to find the right balance there. I mean, that's as far as I can go right now.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, we still have 15 minutes. I will give the floor to the public. The idea is half an hour. Yeah. The idea is to get 4 or 5 questions, and after that, our speakers will answer to the questions. There's someone in the.
Hello, good morning. My name is John. I'm a PhD candidate here in Lisbon, starting this fall. I focus on human overpopulation and other dynamics of population, be it immigration, and I'm very glad that it was brought here on this place, since I'm an ecologist as well. For starters, as Dr. Araújo said, population. Yes. Okay, I'm sorry. Did you hear all of that? Okay. Okay, so continuing. Demography is very important. So for starters, you talked about solutions. I would suggest that if we are here to look at the SDGs, we have to be aware that population is missing entirely in the SDGs. And we have to have the United Nations make a proclamation on that. So to put on the agenda a motive for that. But my question would be on the end of the equilibrium of being an optimist and a pessimist that you were speaking right now. So I would be on the pessimist side. So I guess that we are talking here about climate change, but climate change is only one of the many planetary boundaries that are being breached. So we all are aware that we have ecological collapse and many other problems. So I would ask the panel to name one of their main reasons to remain optimists at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentations. I enjoyed them, but I say that I enjoyed more the one that I could see and understand better. So, Dr. Ribeiro, I have some question for you, because I think you are not very happy at all with renewables. You did not mention anything about them, but put the emphasis on new technology in other areas. And also some old solutions like greening the desert. Well, I must say I'm not very happy with this solution, because by doing this, you exchange a natural biome with all the life which is associated with something totally artificial, which is only for us solving our energy and climate change problem. And I find this a very one-dimensional approach, and I'm not very happy with one-dimensional approaches in an ecology forum. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marco Moretti. I have just two questions, very simple. In this very broad picture you gave, what is the role of the individuals? So what is the role of each of us, daily consumptions, decisions about transportation, about food? Is maybe a drop in the ocean, but we are many. And the other key words I would like to ask about is degrow. I don't know whether it exists in English, decrescita. It has been also brought as a possible solution to not still thinking growing economically, but degrow. Yes, these are my questions.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Andres. Thank you for the open day, by the way. So my question is related with the last question about our personal input and also about the personal ethics. In this conference, we are all working in ecology, in conservation, and therefore there are a lot of times there are ideas coming that we should somehow set an example for other people. If we are the ones who care more, like we should do everything in our hands, and we cannot ask other people to do this kind of stuff without doing that. Which I don't know if is right. That's part of the question. And so that's it. Should we do that? And as a provocative part of it, should we fly from far away to come to this kind of conferences? Is that okay?
Okay, one more question, please.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talks. You mentioned consumption as one of the main problems, and I would totally agree with this. However, we know from many studies that after a certain point, and this point is very low, consumption doesn't increase well-being and it doesn't increase happiness. However, in this discussion and in your discussion, I missed it as well.
Can you put your microphone closer, please?
Yeah, in this discussion, we rarely focus on the question why we don't question the paradigm of consumption and even of increasing consumption. It doesn't increase happiness, it doesn't increase well-being. So maybe we should think more about why we always think we need increased consumption and growing, as already mentioned. And I think we do something very similar like we do as climate scientists. We know how to model linear climate change models, but we don't know how to model the abrupt changes. So we just do the one thing we know, but we don't do the thing we should do and we should think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll not take more questions. Okay, one more, please. Just one more.
Thank you very much. In fact, the debate quite answered one of my questions on the role of individuals. We edit recently a call for climate with the French Society for Ecology and Evolution. And one part was the question of politics. Do we have to stay ecological researcher, or do we have to ask for politics in that question? And it was quite a debate in the society, in fact. So at the end, we had some politics, and I'm happy to see this debate today. My other question is a role for students, because I'm also a teacher, and I make some interviews with my students, bachelor levels. They apply for master degrees, and there was one word coming into their mouth. It was acting. They absolutely want to act, so how can they act? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Elena, can you start answering if you want to choose a specific question? Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
If you want to choose a specific one.
Well, they are all very relevant, and I really appreciate all of them. So, but I will try to be short. As for the optimism, and I really liked your well. I'm optimistic in a way, and actually I'm divided, as Miguel was saying, between skeptical and optimistic. But then I'm not denying that is clear. The most optimistic agenda that we have got recently, in my opinion, is the Agenda 2030. So I'm happy to be in a meeting where these SDGs are the main, are the roadmap. And I think this is the most powerful political agenda that we've managed to establish recently. So I'm very much engaged with it, and I think that if we really take it and use it in our individual lives, community lives, and schools, all kinds of environments, I think this can be a very powerful agenda. Even though, as you said, this is not explicitly demography as an aspect, but somehow it's transversal to the SDGs. So if we really take these goals and have them expressed in our daily lives, I think this can make a difference. So this, I will be in favor, and this is my optimistic response in a way, because I agree with you, the scenarios are not so optimistic. And another interesting question was regarding the greening of the biome desert. Of course, I agree with you absolutely. And this is a nonsense, because we do know that it's not possible. This All Green project that I was talking about in the Sahel is really a flop, and in spite of a lot of money that is being invested, it's not possible. And even in that case, they are using one special tree, which is an acacia, that is really very much into that environment. But even using this species, it's not possible, because they have in the wettest part of this Sahel, they have between 150 and 300 millimeters of rain per year. So this is very much in the borderline, and even in these conditions, it's not possible. So I don't think this will be an attainable goal. But in anyway, I also agree with you. This is the kind of arguments we keep using while we are denying the actual situation, and we don't want to face what is really what we have to face in order to come up with the new solutions. But again, I assume science and technology inside of the equation. I think they are part of the solution. As for I would like to say, come up with the personal ethics and the role of individuals. And I like to bring up this issue because I think that regarding ethics, as we are in a meeting where ecology is the science that is going to be running every day, it's very good to see that at the European Union level they come up with these mission boards, and I'm very fan of these mission boards, and I think they are a very nice pillar in order to combine with the typical science that we like to do and we should go on and should do. But together, maybe if we have a combined agenda of a mission that is, this together with science, I think this we should all try, in our ecological scientific community, we should try to see and follow up these mission boards and see what they're going to do. And this can help in order to contaminate, the good values of science and all the ethics that you were calling, and I also support. And just a last comment, the very last comment. Of course, I drove into here. I apologize. I didn't fly, but I drove. But I agree with you. We should more and more come up with I read in the newspaper, KLM last week was convincing the clients not to fly so much, and so some way this is coming. And regarding just one last comment on the consumption and the growth, and I think that we should discuss it. So I would support this kind of discussion, because most probably we'll have to discuss it and see if we can. Why should we keep talking about growth and even sustainable growth and not degrowth, and see what can we, if we can come up with other indicators. For example, why should we keep GDP as the main indicator of development? Why shouldn't we discuss other indicators that can, be most adequate to change the world as we would like to? Just really a very last comment on the action of the students. This is my hope. I mean, this is another, together with the Agenda 2030, I would say that the action that we are seeing worldwide in terms of, especially the young students, in my opinion, they also bring up this optimistic flag that we need, because they see they have to change and they are pushing us for this change. So I hope they can really make the difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Bernardo, please.
Thank you. It's always nice to speak after Elena, because she says most of what I was going to say anyway. Just 2 or 3 points. I remain optimistic because when we had the issue of the ozone layer a couple of decades ago, we managed to involve everybody in the world to fight the ozone layer. I'm not sure if it worked. You probably in the room knows much better than I do if the ozone layer recovered. But everybody in the planet was involved in solving the issue of the ozone layer. Nowadays, probably the worst job in the world would be to be the owner of a plastic bag manufacturing unit, because we all involve in fighting plastic and microplastic and etc. So there's moments where we all come together to address a catastrophe that will hit us all. I'm not sure, and I don't understand why we haven't, as a species, embraced climate change. We embrace the ozone layer, we embrace the plastics. What is missing for all of us to understand that climate change is an issue and we need to address it as an issue, a global issue? And I have no answer to that. I've been questioning around why we were worried about the ozone layer, why are we worried about plastics, but we haven't yet gone around to be worried about climate change. But I hope we will get there. One second comment is about the impact that we all can have individually. And let me go back to my day job, which is I'm on the board of a small sustainable development investment bank. So we invest in public projects that have impact on sustainable development in developing countries. We only support private businesses that can show us that their business will have a positive impact on sustainable development in developing or emerging economies. And we see more and more and more private businesses addressing and incorporating SDGs as their way of doing businesses. Partly because it's driven by law. There's lots of legislation now in SDGs and sustainability in businesses. Partly, and this is the interesting thing, partly because it's imposed by their clients. Lots of people now will choose sustainable companies over non-sustainable companies. And that is probably the key element that will make every business go into sustainability. And partly also, and this is also important, there are much more funding available for private businesses that can show sustainable environmental and social impacts on their business than for those who cannot. So for a business to obey the law, to make your client happy, and to find financing, to be sustainable is much better than not to be sustainable. So I'm optimistic on the role of citizens as a whole. If we manage to do the ozone layer and if we are managing to change plastics, I'm sure we will find a way of doing climate change. And I'm also optimistic because businesses and corporations are, either because they want or because they're being forced by their clients and by law and by financing, are moving into sustainability as their core business. Oil companies are no longer oil companies, they are now energy companies. Car manufacturers are no longer car manufacturers, they are now mobility organizations, and on and on and on.
Felix, please.
I want to perhaps to speak about something which is demography. There was in this session several references to demography. But I must say that the alternative solution for demography is a wave of epidemics. And I don't think it is a good solution to put our hope in epidemics. So we must discover a way of understanding that we have changed of the world. Nowadays we have two big civilization states, China and India. Both of them want to develop and to grow. They are rivals in Asia. And so they are going to want to grow. So we that are more developed, we must lead in what concerns the change of energy paradigm. We have the obligation to discover and to put in practice many solutions that we can develop. We that have been developed from decades. But we cannot say to India and to China that no. We have the growth is not a goal. Because if we do this, and if we also try to not explore hydrocarbons without burning them, because the problem of hydrocarbons is the problem of making them, we have to learn to use fire, not to use hydrocarbons, because hydrocarbons are a precious compound that nature has given us with hydrogen and carbon. Okay. But what I think is we must be very careful and respectful with people of other civilizations that our own. And I'm very optimistic about this because, for example, this is the last thing I will do. We are discovering a new way of doing war. Nobody today speaks about weapons of mass destruction. Today we speak about weapons of total or partial paralyzation. Because as everybody is linked to cyberspace, to internet, so this is a huge advance of our species. We don't speak about weapons of mass destruction, we are speaking about weapons of total or partial paralyzation. Nobody present here is going to be in accord with me, but I think we are an extraordinary species. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel, to finish.
Okay, so there was a bunch of questions that were very interesting. My notes, they're all about, a lot of them are about individual action. How can people act, degrowth, etc., and optimism, reasons for optimism. I have kids, and I try to teach them some of the things I believe in, and I find it extremely difficult. One of them is consumption. Not being overly eager to consume. I took them now to Mozambique, where they faced for the first time extreme poverty, and they were astonished by what they were seeing. Right? And one of the reasons why I went there and showed them and exposed them, for 2 days their breakfast was biscuits because there was nothing else to have. It was the first time in their life they were exposed to that. And I don't think I can see the effect of that as yet because we just arrived. But it's certainly brewing in their minds. But I reckon that it's very difficult for a father, or for a mother, or for anyone to educate their children in the way you want them to be. That's probably a recipe for failure. It will not happen. So if it will not happen for my children, I have no expectation that we can preach to the world and make them saints, to use the words that Felix used before. We are what we are, and every policy that is based on changing human nature has failed in the past. It doesn't mean that we cannot evolve and progress. I mean, now civilization, we tend to look down at slavery. We don't like that concept. That's very recent. So there are advances. We can advance collectively, but individually we still the Cro-Magnon in the cage as in our genotypes. So can we do something? Of course we can. Some people matter more than others. Some people will have their own individual effect, and they might want to have a smaller footprint that would have otherwise if they're not conscious of their actions. So is that important in the grand scheme of things? Well, it's important at the scale of that person, right? So I think we cannot say that it's not important to our individual actions. But the reason why I still maintain some optimism is that you can see some people with greater responsibilities having a tremendous impact. And I'm going to name one because I was asked one reason to remain optimistic. And Elon Musk was already referred here. He's an intellectual, brilliant guy. He's an inventor, coming up with new ideas, new technologies for mobility and for energy, etc. And when he has one idea that he can't really develop in his lifetime, is releasing the patent. Releasing the patents, sharing patents, is one of the policies that has been argued for quite a long, more than 2 decades now. It's one of the main game changers for climate change, because part of the solution is societal and political, and we've talked about that. But the other part, and a big part of it, is going to be technological. So sharing patents of things that have an impact on climate change mitigation, adaptation, etc., is very important because it speeds up innovation and also shares technology with countries that wouldn't have the opportunity to create those things. One example is the Hyperloop. Is a train that moves in magnetic fields, barely consumes any energy at all, goes at more than 1,000 kilometers per hour. It's the future. I mean, TGVs are Stone Age now. We shouldn't build a TGV. We should build a Hyperloop. And they are part of the components are being made here in Spain. So because Elon Musk released the patents, lots of companies are picking up on that and building the Hyperloop. So that's a good example. And so it's an individual action. He's a guy. He's crazy. Everyone knows he's a genius, but also he has this thing. But humankind is made of all of these different things. People are different, and the role of individuals can be very important. Degrowth, is it possible? I don't think it is. I don't think we can go for a degrowth economy without creating wars, without creating backlashes. because degrowth, as we know it, at least for now, it creates unemployment, massive unemployment. Unemployment creates unhappiness, creates massive political change. Eventually, might create even worse. So unless the economists come up with a new model for growing without growing, I think the answer is what Elena said about coming up with ways to improve sustainable development. Yeah, so the question of consumption, I think I already answered them. I mean, can we question the paradigm of consumption? Well, on one hand is related to degrowth, and on the other hand is related to this idea of changing human nature. Of course, we should and must try. I mean, I came by train, by the way. Change our habits to be more sustainable, but we can't control individual people's choices. So that's very difficult.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix, Bernardo, Helena, Miguel. Thank you also to the public. We'll finish now these Lisbon talks. Thank you very much. Três minutos a mais. Fantástico. A parte do otimista e da negação eu acho relativamente importante. Ser otimista sem ser negacionista. Sim, sim.